The year is 1348. You wake to the sound of coughing, and by sunset your village is gone. Welcome to the Black Death. It begins like any other morning in your small medieval. The sun rises slowly over thatched roofs, casting long shadows across cobblestone paths worn smooth by countless feet. There's a stillness in the air, a tension that seems to hang over everything like morning mist that refuses to lift. Drop a comment with your location. It's amazing how our little community spans the globe, all connected by these stories that help us drift into peaceful sleep. Now dim those lights, maybe adjust your pillow, and let's discover together why even the bravest souls trembled at the thought of Black Death. You hear it first in the distance, a persistent cough echoing from the house next to your pillow, then another and another. The sound carries on the gentle breeze, mixing with the usual morning chorus of roosters and church bells. Rumours have been travelling faster than merchants along the trade routes. Stories of entire cities emptying, of ships arriving in harbours with no living soul aboard. You've heard these tales whispered in taverns and marketplaces, dismissed them as the fevered imaginings of frightened minds. But now, as you listen to that coughing grow closer, you begin to understand that some nightmares are painfully, terrifyingly real. The Black Death doesn't announce itself with fanfare or warp. It arrives quietly, almost gently, like a thief in the night. In one moment, you're living your ordinary life, tending to your small plot of land, trading goods at the market, sharing meals with your family. The first signs are deceptively mild. A slight fever, perhaps, the kind you might expect after a long day's work in the fields. You tell yourself it's nothing. You felt worse after too much ale at the harvest festival. But as the hours pass, the fever climbs higher, and with it comes a bone-deep exhaustion that no amount of rest can cure. And by the second day, the headaches begin. They start as a dull throb behind your eyes and gradually intensify until even the soft light filtering through your small robes. Your family gathers around your bedside, their faces etched with worry, but their voices sound distant, as if they're speaking to you from across a vast chasm. Swellings appear next, and with them, any hope that this might be a common ailment fades entirely. They start small, staying the jade with you show brow for Norman and Costumet the Goody Gowns, but they grow with alarming speed, becoming sound. These swellings are your body's lymph nodes, desperately trying to fight an infection they cannot comprehend. They stretch your skin, taut and hot, throbbing with each heartbeat. Pain is constant now, a dull ache that sharpens to agony whenever you try to move. Your family tries to help, applying cool cloths and herbal poultices passed down through generations, but their remedies feel powerless against this unseen enemy. As the third day dawns, your world narrows to the confines of your straw mattress. The coughing starts around this time, not the dry hack of winter illness, but something deeper and more troubling. Each cough brings up dark spots of blood, staining the rough cloth your family holds. With each laboured breath, you can feel something vital slipping away, like water through cupped hands. You see faces of loved ones long dead, hear conversations that make perfect sense in the moment, but dissolve into nonsense when you try to remember them. The skin around your buboes begins to change colour, taking on shades of purple and black that speak of something fundamentally wrong within your body. These dark patches spread slowly across your skin like spilled ink on parchment, a visible sign of the battle being waged beneath the surface. A battle you are losing while your family maintains their vigil, taking turns sitting beside your bed, cooling your fevered brow, whispering prayers and words of comfort. But you can see the fear in their eyes, the growing recognition that this is unlike anything they've encountered before. A local physician, when he finally arrives, examines you with trembling hands before stepping back, his face pale beneath his hood. Your lungs feel heavy, as if filled with water, and each breath requires more energy than you possess. The world takes on a dreamlike quality, sounds becoming muffled and distant. Your family's voices reach you as if from a great distance, their words of love and encouragement echoing in the growing darkness of your fading consciousness. It moves through bodies with mechanical efficiency, shutting down systems one by one until nothing remains but the shell of what once was a vibrant, living person. For you, as for millions of others during those dark years, there will be no recovery, no miraculous cure. To understand how this devastating plague reached your quiet village, we must follow its path across continents and centuries. The story begins far from your medieval European village, in the vast steppes of Central Asia. Among communities of traders and nomads, the bacterium Yersinia pestis had existed for centuries in a delicate balance with its host, primarily rodents and their fleas. This microscopic organism had evolved alongside these creatures, creating a complex ecosystem of infection and survival that might have remained localized for generations more. Trade routes stretched like arteries across the known world, carrying not just goods and gold, but ideas, cultures, and invisible passengers that would reshape human history. The Silk Road, that famous network of commercial pathways, linked east and west in ways that previous generations could never have imagined. Traveled these routes in great caravans, their wagons loaded with silk and spices, precious metals, and exotic goods. These traders were hardy souls, accustomed to months on dangerous roads, extreme weather, and the constant threat of bandits. These rodents, seeking food and shelter, made their homes in the grain stores and cargo holds of merchant vessels and caravans. Rather, it was their passengers, tiny fleas that fed on rodent blood and could carry Yersinia pestis in their digestive systems. When an infected flea bit a rat, the bacteria multiplied rapidly, often killing the host within days. But the fleas, now desperate for a new source of blood, would seek out other hosts. Sometimes, in the absence of rats, those hosts were human. As trade caravans moved westward, they unknowingly transported this lethal cargo. And the plague spread along commercial routes like fire along a trail of gunpowder, jumping from community to community with terrifying efficiency. Cities that had thrived as trading hubs suddenly found themselves at the epicenter of devastation. Constantinople, that great crossroads between Europe and Asia, was among the first major European cities to feel the plague's impact. Ships arriving from the Black Sea brought more than exotic goods. Sailors who had been healthy when they departed their home ports arrived as corpses, their vessels becoming floating tombs that docked in bustling harbours. From Constantinople, the plague spread with inexorable logic along established trade networks. Italian merchant cities, grown wealthy from their connections to eastern markets, Genoa, Venice, and Pisa, these proud maritime republics that had built their fortunes on international commerce, became entry points for devastation. Ships would appear on the horizon, their sails full and their course true, but as they drew closer to shore, observers would notice the eerie silence aboard. Docking masters would board these vessels to find crews dead at their posts, cargo holds filled with the stench of decay, and rats, always rats, scurrying among the merchandise. Decent, but the cities themselves provided ideal conditions for the plague's spread. Medieval urban centres were crowded, unsanitary places where humans and animals. Streets were narrow and often unpaved, filled with waste and refuse that attracted rodents. The urban population, already weakened by periodic famines and harsh living conditions, proved especially vulnerable to this new threat. The plague moved through city districts like water through a sieve, leaving devastation in its wake. Entire neighborhoods would empty within days, their inhabitants either dead or fled in terror. From these urban centers, the plague spread outward along smaller trade routes and pathways. Merchants fleeing infected cities carried the disease to smaller towns and villages. Pilgrims traveling to religious sites unknowingly transported death across vast distances. Even armies, moving across the landscape in their campaigns, became vectors for the plagues. Your village, remote as it might have seemed from the great centers of commerce and politics, was connected to this vast network through countless small links. Maybe a pilgrim sought shelter for the night, or perhaps a messenger arrived with news from the regional lord's court. Any one of these seemingly innocent encounters could have introduced the plague to your community. The disease moved with a logic that medieval people could not comprehend. They understood that it spread from person to person, but they had no knowledge of bacteria, no understanding of how microscopic organisms could cause such massive devastation. They looked for explanations in the movement of planets, the will of God, or the malevolent influence of certain ethnic groups, anything that might make sense of the senseless destruction surrounding. Weather patterns may have played a role in the plague's spread as well. Some historians suggest that climate changes in the 14th century, a period of cooling temperatures and increased rainfall, may have disrupted rodent populations and forced infected animals into closer contact with human settlers. Floods could have driven rats from their usual habitats, while famines weakened human immune systems and made populations more susceptible to disease. The sheer scale of medieval trade networks meant that once the plague gained a foothold in major commercial centres, its spread became virtually inevitable. It travelled these routes continuously, creating an endless stream of potential infection sources. Shipment of grain might harbour infected rats that would establish new colonies in distant ports. Military campaigns also contributed to the plague's. Armies moving across the landscape created disruption and displacement that could scatter infected populations across wide areas. The Siege of Kaffa, a Genoese trading post on the Black Sea, became legendary when attacking Mongol forces allegedly catapulted plague-infected corpses over the city walls. By the time the plague reached your village, it had already devastated much of the known world. Cities that had stood for centuries lay partially empty. Trade routes that had once bustled with activity had become paths of death. The great commercial networks that had brought prosperity and cultural exchange had been transformed into highways of horror. And as the Black Death swept across Europe, it revealed the full spectrum of human nature, from the noblest acts of compassion to the darkest depths of desperation and cruelty. The responses to this unprecedented catastrophe varied dramatically, shaped by religious beliefs, social structures, and the simple human need. In your village, as in countless others, the first response was often confusion and disbelief. The local priest, a man who had served your community faithfully for decades, found himself facing questions that his theological training had never prepared him to answer. Why would a loving God allow such suffering? What sins had your community committed to deserve such punishment? These questions echoed from pulpits across Europe as religious leaders struggled to provide comfort and explanation to their terrified congregation. Many clergy members saw the plague as a divine punishment for humanity's sins, a biblical catastrophe comparable to the Great Flood or the plagues of Egypt. This interpretation led to a surge in religious fervour, as people sought to appease God's wrath through prayer, fasting, and acts of penance. Churches became centres of desperate activity, filled day and night with believers seeking salvation through devotion. But the plague struck the clergy as hard as any other group, perhaps harder due to their close contact with the sick and dying. Priests who administered last rites, monks who cared for the ill, and nuns who tended to orphaned children all faced constant exposure to the disease. The death toll among religious communities was staggering. Entire monasteries were wiped out, leaving behind empty buildings and silent chapel. Churches stood empty, not because congregations had lost their faith, but because there was no one left to lead services. In some communities, laypeople took on religious duties traditionally reserved for ordained clergy, leading prayers and performing simple ceremonies in the absence of proper priests. The medical response to the plague was equally desperate and largely ineffective. The physicians of the 14th century, working with medieval understanding of disease and anatomy, were completely unprepared for a pandemic of this scale. Medical knowledge, based largely on ancient Greek and Roman texts, provided few tools for understanding or treating the plague. Medieval medicine relied heavily on the theory of humours, the belief that illness resulted from imbalances in the body's 4 essential fluids: Physicians attempted to treat plague victims by trying to restore humoral balance through bloodletting, purging, and the application of various herbal remedies. These treatments, while well-intentioned, often weakened patients further and may have hastened their deaths. Some doctors fled entirely, abandoning their practices and their patients in the face of a disease they could neither understand, when others remained at their posts, treating patient after patient despite knowing that their efforts were largely futile. Many of these dedicated physicians ultimately died alongside those they tried to help. The most iconic medical figures of the plague era were the plague doctors, with their distinctive long-beaked masks filled with aromatic substances believed to purify the air they breathed. These physicians, often hired by entire cities rather than individual patients, moved through infected areas like strange, otherworldly creatures. Their protective clothing, long leather coats, gloves, and those haunting bird-like masks created an image that would haunt European imagination for centuries. But even these specialized plague doctors could do little beyond documenting the disease's progress and providing basic comfort to the dying. Their treatments, burning aromatic woods, bleeding patients, prescribing various herbal concoctions, were based more on hope and tradition than on any real understanding of the plague's nature. As traditional medical and religious authorities proved powerless against the plague, more extreme responses began to emerge. Groups of religious zealots known as flagellants travelled from town to town, publicly whipping themselves and each other in elaborate ceremonies designed to appease God's wrath. These processions, featuring hundreds of participants dressed in white robes and carrying banners, would arrive in plague-stricken communities and perform their bloody rituals in public. The flagellant movement attracted followers across all social classes. Nobles and peasants, merchants and craftsmen, all joined these processions in desperate attempts to find meaning and salvation in the face of overwhelming death. They believed that by taking God's punishment upon themselves through physical suffering, they could spare their communities from further devastation. But the flagellant movement also created new problems. These large gatherings of people moving from place to place may have actually helped spread the plague to previously uninfected areas. Moreover, their apocalyptic preaching and emphasis on divine punishment often created panic and social unrest rather than the spiritual healing they sought to provide. Perhaps the most tragic response to the plague was the persecution of minority groups, particularly Jewish communities. People desperately sought someone to blame for the inexplicable catastrophe surrounding them. Ancient prejudices and suspicions erupted into violence. Accusations spread that Jewish communities had poisoned wells or conspired with the devil to bring about the plague. These accusations were completely false and utterly illogical. Jewish communities suffered from the plague at the same rates as their Christian neighbors, and many Jewish physicians and scholars worked tirelessly to help regardless of their faith, but logic and reason often disappeared in the face of overwhelming fear and grief. Pogroms erupted across Europe as Christian mobs attacked Jewish neighborhoods, burning homes and synagogues. Some Jewish communities were completely destroyed, their members killed or driven into exile. This persecution represented one of the darkest chapters in European Jewish history, demonstrating how quickly civilization could collapse when fear overwhelmed compassion and reason. The social fabric of medieval society began to unravel as the plague continued its devastating progress. Traditional hierarchies and obligations, which had provided structure for centuries, suddenly seemed meaningless in the face of universal mortality. Serfs abandoned their lords' fields, knowing they might not live to see the harvest. Craftsmen left their workshops and merchants abandoned their trades. Economic systems collapsed as entire industries disappeared virtually overnight. The careful balance of medieval agricultural life, which depended on everyone fulfilling their traditional roles. Fields went unharvested, livestock wandered untended, and trade networks that had taken centuries to develop dissolved in a matter of months. Some communities attempted to maintain order through increasingly harsh measures. Laws were passed requiring people to remain at their posts, forbidding movement between towns, and mandating care for the sick. But these legal structures proved powerless against the scale of the catastrophes. How could laws be enforced when the enforcers themselves were dying? In some places, the breakdown of social order led to violence and chaos, and others retreated into isolated communities, barricading themselves against both the plague and their fellow humans. Yet even in this darkness, there were remarkable examples of human compassion and courage. Some individuals and communities responded to the plague not with fear and blame, but with extraordinary acts of kindness. Physicians who continued treating patients despite the risks to themselves, clergy who comforted the dying when they could offer no cure, ordinary people who cared for orphan children and buried the dead when no one else would. Plague years demonstrated the best of human nature under the worst possible circumstances. Traditional burial practices, which had provided dignity and meaning to death for centuries, became impossible when the number of corpses exceeded the community's ability to conduct individual ceremonies. Mass graves appeared outside settlements, filled with bodies wrapped in simple shrouds or sometimes just stacked like cordwood. The psychological impact of these mass burials cannot be overstated. Medieval European culture placed enormous importance on proper funeral rites, believing that the soul to see loved ones buried in unmarked mass graves without the prayers and ceremonies that had been practiced for generations added spiritual anguish to the already overwhelming burden of grief. Some communities resorted to burning bodies when burial became impossible, a practice that horrified medieval sensibilities but became necessary when graveyards overflowed. The smoke from these funeral pyres created an additional layer of horror, visible for miles. As we reach the end of this dark journey through one of history's most devastating pandemics, it's important to remember that the Black Death was not just a historical event, it was a lived experience for millions of people who faced unimaginables with whatever courage and grace they could muster. If you had lived in 1348, statistical reality suggests you would not have survived. The plague killed an estimated 30 to 60% of Europe's population, with some regions experiencing even higher mortality rates. Entire bloodlines disappeared, villages were abandoned, and centuries of accumulated human knowledge and culture vanished with the people who carried it. Where you lived played a crucial role. Some isolated rural communities escaped the plague entirely, while major cities and trade centres suffered catastrophic loss. Age mattered too. The plague seemed to strike hardest at adults in their prime working years, though no age group was completely spared. Social class provided little protection. Kings and peasants, bishops and beggars, all fell to the same merciless disease. Wealth might have allowed some people to flee infected areas, but it could not purchase immunity from an enemy that travelled with merchants and nobles as readily as with common folk. The speed of the plague's progression meant that most victims had little time to prepare or adapt. Unlike famines or wars, which might unfold over months or years, families that were intact and healthy at the beginning of a month might be completely gone by its end. But perhaps the most haunting aspect of imagining yourself in 1348 is considering not just your own survival, but the world you would have witnessed disappearing around you. Entire communities vanished, leaving behind only empty buildings and overgrown fields. The survivors of the Black Death emerged into a fundamentally different world. The delicate balance between population and resources had been violently disrupted. Entire regions were depopulated, while others struggled with the psychological trauma of unprecedented loss. The survivors rebuilt, adapted, and ultimately created new forms of social organization from the ashes of the old. The massive population decline led to labor shortages that, paradoxically, improved conditions for many of those who remained. Serfs found themselves in demand and could negotiate better terms with lords desperate for workers. Social mobility increased as traditional barriers crumbled along with the institutions that had maintained them. The feudal system, already showing signs of strain, weakened further as its human foundations literally died away. Urban centres, once they recovered, grew in importance relative to rural agriculture. New forms of art and literature emerged, often infused with a darker, more realistic view of human mortality and the fragility of earthly achievements. Medical understanding, while still primitive by modern standards, began to evolve more rapidly as physicians grappled with the need to understand epidemic disease. The plague experience planted seeds that would eventually grow into more systematic approaches to public health and medical research. Religious thought, too, was permanently changed. The easy certainties of medieval theology were challenged by a catastrophe that seemed to strike good and evil alike. New forms of religious expression emerged, often emphasizing personal spirituality over institutional authority, individual relationship with the divine over collective religious experience. The Black Death also left its mark on human consciousness in ways that extended far beyond the immediate medieval period. The experience of society-wide mortality created cultural changes that would influence European thought. Art became more focused on death and human frailty. Literature explored themes of mortality and the uncertainty of life with new intensity. Even architecture reflected these changed sensibilities, with churches and public buildings incorporating symbols and themes related to death and judgment. Modern historians continue to study the Black Death not just as a historical curiosity, but as a window into how human societies respond to existential threats. The pandemic revealed both the best and worst of human nature, the capacity for both selfless courage and cruel scapegoating, for both rational adaptation and desperate irrationality. In our own time, as we've experienced our own global pandemic, the medieval response to the Black Death takes on new relevance. We can see echoes of 14th century reactions in modern responses to COVID-19. The initial disbelief and confusion, the search for someone to blame, the tension between individual freedom and collective responsibility, religious institutions, but we can also appreciate how much human knowledge and capability have advanced. Where medieval communities could only react to disease after it arrived, modern public health systems can track and sometimes prevent epidemics before they become pandemics. The story of the Black Death ultimately reminds us that human civilization, for all its achievements, the elaborate social structures, economic systems, and cultural traditions that seem so solid, can be disrupted by forces beyond human control. Yet it also demonstrates the remarkable capacity of human beings to endure, adapt, and rebuild even after experiencing losses that seem insurmountable. The statistical reality is harsh and unforgiving, but you did make it in a sense, through the stories, through the cultural memory, through the genetic inheritance of those who survived. You are here today because some of your ancestors lived through that dark time, carried forward the human story, and passed it on to subsequent generations. The medieval world that died with the Black Death was gone forever, but something new was born from its ashes. The survivors created new forms of social organization, new ways of understanding the world, new approaches to the fundamental questions of human existence. In their resilience and adaptability, we can find both inspiration and instruction for facing the challenges of our own time. You drift off to sleep tonight, safe in a world with modern medicine and public health systems. Remember those long ago ancestors who faced unimaginable darkness with whatever light they could find. Their courage in the face of the unknown, their determination to preserve what could be saved while adapting to new realities, their refusal to let despair have the final word. These qualities echo across the centuries and remind us that in humanity's darkest hours, the human spirit endures. The Black Death was an ending, but it was also a beginning. From that medieval catastrophe emerged the foundations of the modern world, built by survivors who refused to accept that darkness was permanent. In their stubborn hope and determined rebuilding, we can find lessons for navigating our own uncertainties and challenges, secure in the knowledge that human resilience has been tested by the worst imaginable circumstances and has emerged battered, unbroken, into the light. If you are still here, it means you are one of us. Like and subscribe and drop a comment.